Members of Congress practicing for a charity baseball game. A heavily armed man with a history of angry politics and run-ins with the law. A shooting that could have turned into a massacre. This is Special Report. I'm Chris Wallace, in for Bret Baier. Several people are in the hospital tonight, but they're lucky to be alive. A gunman opened fire this morning at a baseball practice for members of Congress in Alexandria, Virginia. Among the wounded, the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives, Steve Scalise of Louisiana. The gunman was killed and lives saved by 2 members of the Capitol Police Force. We have Fox team coverage. Catherine Herridge tells us about the shooter. But we begin with Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel at the crime scene just outside Washington. Good evening, Mike.
Chris, good evening. The FBI says the gunman had been in the area since March, living in his vehicle, a white cargo van, and had 2 weapons, a rifle and a handgun, a gunman taking aim at Republican lawmakers. Eyewitness video reveals the moment of the attack early this morning.
A lot of us dove into the dugout and tried to get as many as we could. But then at that point, there was firing behind us from the security detail of the Capitol Police. And I started yelling back, "Are you friendly?"
Those on the GOP team were left trying to make sense of the violence.
This political rhetoric and political discourse that has led to hate has led to gunfire. I never thought I'd go to baseball practice for charity and have to dodge bullets.
The Capitol Police began returning fire. I do believe that without the Capitol Hill Police, it would have been a massacre. House
Republican Whip Steve Scalise was wounded and remains in critical condition after surgery. Staffer Zachary Barth and former staffer Matt Micah were also hurt. And Special Agents David Bailey and Crystal Griner were injured responding to the attack. President Trump reacted from the White House.
Authorities are continuing to investigate the crime, and the assailant has now died from his injuries.
Authorities identified the gunman as James Hodgkinson of Illinois. He was a campaign volunteer for Senator Bernie Sanders.
I am sickened by this despicable act, and let me be as clear as I can be. Violence of any kind is unacceptable in our society, and I condemn this action in the strongest possible terms.
Just before the shooting, one player said he was approached by the suspect.
He asked me if this team was the Republican or Democrat team practicing. I responded that it was a Republican team practicing, and he proceeded to shoot Republicans. You take that for what it's worth.
Members of the Democrats' team stopped at their practice this morning to pray for the GOP players. House members were told that the congressional baseball game would go on as planned, and sources say that received a standing ovation.
We're not going to let incidents like this change our way of life or our daily routines.
It will be play ball tomorrow night at 7:05.
The annual games expected to raise more than $600,000, benefiting local boys and girls clubs and a literacy group, and Scalise plays second base. By midday, Speaker Paul Ryan addressed the House, calling for solidarity.
We are united in our shock. We are united in our anguish. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us.
Moments later, House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi echoed a bipartisan sentiment.
We are not one caucus or the other in this House today, but we speak for each other in saying that we send our thoughts and prayers to our colleague, Steve Scalise.
Among the questions now, do rank-and-file lawmakers need armed security? Some of those who were on the field this morning seem shaken by the events, what law enforcement just described as a combat scene. And in that theme of unity, the Democrats team has offered to host the Republican team for dinner. Chris?
Mike Emanuel at the crime scene just outside Washington. Mike, thanks for that. We have been gathering information all day about the gunman. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has that part of the story.
Law enforcement identifies the suspect as 66-year-old James Hodgkinson of Illinois. A Facebook page bearing the same name includes photos of Bernie Sanders as well as anti-Trump rhetoric. One post reads, "Trump is a traitor. Trump has destroyed our democracy. It's time to destroy Trump and company."
I've given a statement to the Alexandria Police Department.
Republican Congressman Jeff Duncan says he believes the suspect approached him at the ball field.
I did have an interaction with someone in the parking lot who asked me if the team practicing was a Democrat or a Republican team. I told him they were Republicans. He said, "Okay, thanks," turned around. I got in the car and left.
And that was the conversation he had, and it was only as they were driving
and they said
back
he
that they heard
acted
the
a
news
little
reports.
weird.
Yeah,
when he did.
A spokesperson for the American Society of Home Inspectors confirms a James Hodgkinson was a member of the trade association but dropped out in 2015. A few years earlier, a local Illinois newspaper reports that the suspect sent letters to the editor railing against Republicans and tax policies. In this August 2012 letter, Hodgkinson writes, "I have never said life sucks, only the policies of the Republicans." This man says he's a friend of the suspect.
Well, he never backed down from anybody. In a bar fight or whatever, he stood his ground.
But it was that kind of kid stuff, or was it political?
No.
The New York Times interviewed the suspect's brother, who says the 66-year-old was upset over the election of President Trump and went to Washington within the last few weeks to protest. This account appears consistent with a local news report that a neighbor had not seen Hodgkinson in months, though his wife still lives at this home in Belleville, Illinois, where the FBI is on the scene. A law enforcement source tells Fox the Bureau gets involved when police officers and members of Congress are assaulted. At this morning's news conference,
we had no prior information that would lead us to believe that anything like this was going to occur.
Are you certain members of Congress were being targeted, though? Was this an intentional attack on members of Congress?
Too early to tell if they were targeted or not.
At a news conference within the last hour, the FBI confirming that the ATF is running a trace on 2 weapons to include a rifle and a handgun, also saying that the FBI is very focused on a motive, and so far no indication why the suspect chose today, Chris.
Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's get more now from 2 congressmen who were at that field practicing when the shooting started. Jack Bergman is a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General, congressman from Michigan. Brad Wenstrup is a doctor and a veteran of the Iraq War, congressman from Ohio. First, gentlemen, let me say how glad I am to see both of you here tonight. And let me begin with that, Congressman. How are you? I assume the shock is beginning to wear off and you realize what you were through.
Well, you know, we're all here by the grace of God. And I think a hand played in today, because you look at the potential scenarios and outcomes, could have been a lot different if the Capitol Police hadn't done what they did.
Congressman Wenstrup.
Well, the situation's surreal in many ways. I've been in that type of environment before, and you just let your instincts kick in and go to work. But what other people need to know, especially people who have never been in that environment, they have to know what normal is. And afterwards is when it starts to kick in, and you start thinking about your family and what maybe could have happened today. And they just need to be prepared for that.
Congressman Wenstrup, you were a combat surgeon in Iraq. You've been in these kinds of situations before. How intense was what people are now calling a combat zone, a firefight?
Oh, it was very intense, especially from the standpoint that we didn't have weapons, and from the standpoint that you don't have infantry and other troops around you that can take action. But we did have 2 very excellent Capitol Hill police that did an outstanding job and got injured in the process, but they carried out their mission.
Congressman Bergman, did you think at any point in this that this might be it for you and for all of your colleagues?
Absolutely. When we were in the dugout after scrambling around beforehand, my only thought was if he breaks through the Capitol Police and comes around that corner into that dugout, we were all sitting ducks.
Yeah, I mean, let's just explain the scene. You were on the field, you crawled off the field, you went behind the dugout, then you went in, which was slightly below the ground, but you were all unprotected. So if he had been able to get there, you were all just lined up. You were just sitting ducks, as you say.
We were looking for anything that we could pick up if he came around the corner to engage him.
Congressman Wenstrup, tough question. Yeah. Did you, at any point in this, did you think to yourself, this may be it? We could die here?
I really wasn't thinking about that. It was much more about how we're going to get through this. And he was very calculated. He used the third base dugout as protection. He used another building as protection. And he was calculated, and he was herding us into one spot. And without the Capitol Hill Police there to fight back, I don't even want to think about how that
When
might
you
have
say
been.
he was herding you into one spot, explain that, because I've not heard that before.
Well, there was only one entrance into the park, and once you're in that park and on the field, you're inside of a fence. And the only way out is through this one entrance by the first base dugout. And so he starts down on the left field line along third base and starts shooting. So where do people run? We run towards the exit, we run towards the dugout,
right,
and you try to take cover. And then he starts maneuvering closer to that spot, and then even comes around from behind home plate. And that's what led to his demise.
Now, what do you explain that?
Because the Capitol Hill police were in that position, and they were positioned to where they could fire back.
Where were they? I mean, you were all in the dugout. You're on the field, you're in the dugout. Where were the police before the shooting started?
They are outside that exit that we described that's on the first base line and by the dugout. That's where they're positioned. And when this started happening, you know, they get out behind their car and start to position. So he was coming closer. We had people that were taking cover behind trees and then trying to move behind hardened facilities. They had to move because he was moving, and they weren't safe just in one spot behind the tree.
But when did you hear, and how grateful were you, Congressman Bergman, when you started to hear the Capitol Police joining this fight?
Extremely grateful, because they were our last really form of defense that we had at that point.
Congressman Wenstrup, as soon as the shooting stopped, you rushed out on the field to your colleague Steve Scalise, who had been hit. He's through surgery. He apparently is in critical condition, according to the hospital. As somebody who was there, a doctor tending to his wounds, how badly hit was he?
Well, you can't really tell, because I found the entry wound. I was able to go in and open things up to where I could see where he was hit.
Which is where?
Which was on his left hip, on the side, and I could not see an exit wound. So what that's telling me is I don't know where that actually trajected. Was it lodged in his hip? Did it move further up? Did it hit internal organs? Did it hit large vessels? So although you got the bleeding controlled, which we were able to do with tourniquet, etc., in that spot, you don't know what other damage is taking place inside. That was my concern. I kept talking to him. He answered my questions. We got him fluids as best we could, because I knew he's losing some fluid inside there. And as soon as he could get some help, get an IV, then I was off to the hospital.
Congressman Bergman, there have been a lot of calls today for unity on Capitol Hill, for dialing down the partisan rhetoric. Obviously, there's a kind of a kumbaya moment right now on the Hill, but do you think it can last? Do you think this can change the way folks do business on Capitol Hill and in all of Washington, including us and the media?
I think it has to change. In fact, one of the stories that would have been a really nice story about 4 months ago was how the freshman class, both Democrats and Republicans, signed a letter of commitment to civility because we didn't like what we were seeing. We're new, we're freshmen. Never got any traction because it wasn't a big deal. Well, I guess I'll tell you what, it's a big deal. Everybody's got skin in the game now. If they don't realize it, have them come talk to some of us.
Same question for you, Congressman Wenstrup. You know, we see these crises. We've seen it all too often before. Not here. This hits home. This hits you guys directly in a way that most of them don't, except for Gabby Giffords. But do you think this maybe changes the division, the partisan, ugly gridlock here in Washington?
You know, I certainly hope so. Just a week or so ago, I actually wrote a piece that I entitled "United We Stand, Divided We Fall." We have been tearing each other apart in far too many ways, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's the media, whether it's individuals just out there in their communities. And I think that we should be celebrating the fact that we live in a country where the people get to decide who their elected officials are. We should be grateful for that. You don't always get the one you voted for, and that shouldn't turn into anger, but it should turn into being part of the debate and part of the policy discussion, and not violence.
Now, the baseball game is on for tomorrow night. Congressman, you going to be there?
Absolutely, in uniform, ready to go.
What position do you play, sir?
Well, I'm infield. I'm a freshman, so I'm one of the backups right now. So, but the point is, I came to play, I came to win, and I came to have fun with folks, all the folks in uniform. In fact, the freshmen, Dems and the Republicans, but even before this happened, we're going to get our photo made tomorrow before the game in a show of freshman unity.
Both parties together.
Absolutely.
And Congressman Wenstrup, you're going to be there tomorrow?
Absolutely. You can't keep me from it now.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thanks for telling us your story. Thanks for your bravery. Thanks for your service to the nation. And maybe out of this tragedy, something good can come. We all hope so.
We hope so.
Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you.
Let's talk more now about the security situation for members of Congress. Fox News senior Capitol Hill producer Chad Pergram joins us from Capitol Hill. Chad, fair to say that if Congressman Scalise, a member of the House leadership, hadn't been there with his security detail, these other members would have had no protection at all.
Well, I think the security people here at the Capitol, the Sergeant at Arms and the Capitol Police Chief, Matt Verderosa, would tell you that the system works. Now, you can't put a detail on 435 members of the House of Representatives. After Gabby Giffords was shot a few years ago, they talked about that. There were some people who suggested that. But at the end of the day, there's no way to do that later on.
So, I mean, routinely, if the House whip had not been there, these folks would have been unprotected. Chad? Apparently we've lost Chad Pergram. We'll try to get him back and continue the conversation. There has been some other news today, and here's a look at the headlines on that. The head of the Michigan Health Department and the state's chief medical officer are among 6 people charged in the Flint water crisis. Health Department Chief Nick Lyon, along with 4 others, are charged with involuntary manslaughter. Authorities say they failed to alert the public after an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease following a switch in Flint's water source. The American college student released from a North Korean prison is in a Cincinnati hospital tonight. 22-year-old Otto Warmbier is in a coma. Warmbier was serving a 15-year prison term in North Korea for trying to steal a propaganda banner. Republican Ed Gillespie and Democratic Lieutenant Governor Ralph Northam are the nominees in Virginia's election for governor. Both won primaries last night. At least 12 people are dead in a huge fire that engulfed a high-rise apartment block in London. Witnesses report seeing children being dropped from windows to people in the street. There is no word yet on the cause of the blaze. And U.S. Marshals confirmed to Fox that 2 Turkish nationals have been arrested for beating demonstrators outside the Turkish embassy in Washington last month. The Federal Reserve is raising its benchmark interest rate for the 3rd time in 6 months. The 0.25% increase puts the rate in the still low range of 1% to 1.25%. The Dow gained 46 to post a new record close. The S&P 500 lost 2.5. NASDAQ dropped 25.5. When we come back, President Trump's call for unity after today's shooting. And later, a high-profile gun tax in one major American city backfires in a big way. President Trump joined the calls for unity following today's shootings. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts says a president who is known for sharp political rhetoric took a very different tone today. Good evening, John.
Good evening to you too, Chris. You know, unity is something that has been glaringly lacking in this country on a number of different levels. And today's attack really was a shocking indication of just how bad things may really be. For the first time since taking office, President Trump addressed the nation about an attack on domestic soil. This one involving members of Congress, including the third-ranking Republican in the House.
Congressman Scalise is a friend, and a very good friend. And Steve, I want you to know that you have the prayers not only of the entire city behind you, but of an entire nation and, frankly, the entire world.
The president also had high praise for the Capitol police officers who took down the shooter. Heroes, he said, who likely prevented a bloodbath.
Many lives would have been lost if not for the heroic actions of the 2 Capitol police officers who took down the gunman despite sustaining gunshot wounds during a very, very brutal assault.
First Lady Melania Trump joined in the praise in a rare tweet, writing, quote, "Thank you to the first responders who rushed in to help protect those who were hurt in Alexandria, Virginia. My thoughts and prayers to everyone." While some members of Congress who were at the ball field blamed what they called political rhetorical terrorism for the attack, President Trump did not address the political environment. He did say all of those who were caught up in this morning's incident are public servants and urged unity in the wake of the attack.
We are strongest when we are unified and when we work together for the common good.
As the president was appealing for unity, Democrats, some 200 of them, slapped him with a lawsuit this morning. It took 17 pages just to list the plaintiffs' names. The suit was yet another challenging the president's continued ownership in his vast business empire, arguing he is robbing Congress of its oversight responsibilities regarding payments from foreign entities, so-called emoluments. The suit claims, quote, defendant has chosen to accept numerous benefits from foreign states without first seeking or obtaining congressional approval. Defendant has thwarted the transparency that the, quote, consent of the Congress provision was designed to provide. The White House dismissed the suit, as it has ones before it, in a statement to Fox News saying, quote, the president's business interests do not violate the emoluments clause. This is another example of the Democrats playing political games instead of working for the American people they were elected to serve. President Trump today also made good on a pledge he articulated repeatedly on the campaign, that when it comes to military matters, he will put his faith and decision-making power in the hands of his defense secretary, including whether to add more troops in Afghanistan.
At noon yesterday, President Trump delegated to me the authority to manage troop numbers in Afghanistan. The delegation of this authority does not at this time change the troop numbers for Afghanistan.
In the wake of today's shooting, President Trump canceled his entire public schedule, including an event at the Labor Department to promote apprenticeships. But we are told that he will likely resume his full public schedule again tomorrow. Chris?
John, as you know, there's been a lot of talk on Capitol Hill from the two congressmen we just had on set about trying to find a way past the partisan rhetoric that is dividing this town, trying to damp it down and trying to maybe create a new sense of unity here. Is there any talk about that, about trying to change the tone at the White House?
Well, this president, all during his campaign, said that he wanted to change the tone in Washington. He wanted to change the status quo, wanted to not make it business as usual. In doing that, he promised that he was going to break probably a few more eggs than a lot of people would have preferred. But Chris, you know, we've been here before. 9/11, other events like that, and we've seen for a moment the country comes together and then inevitably it splits apart again. So not to be a pessimist, but whatever we're seeing today may be short-lived.
Let me ask you one other question before I let you go, John, and that is the congressional baseball game is going to be tomorrow night. Is there any thought of the president attending the game?
No, I mean, he was never thinking about it initially, and the White House has confirmed that plan is not changing. The real problem is that in order to move the president somewhere, particularly in this environment, the Secret Service needs a certain number of days in order to put a security plan in place, and there just isn't time to do it, Chris.
John Roberts reporting from the White House. John, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Let's check in now on the victims of today's shooting. Peter Ducey is at George Washington University Hospital, and Doug McElway is at MedStar Washington Hospital Center, where Congressman Steve Scalise is recovering tonight. Good evening, Doug.
Good evening, Chris. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise was brought here to MedStar Washington Hospital Center early this morning with a gunshot wound to his hip. This is a level 1 trauma center, and it is close to inner city neighborhoods where gunshot wounds are not at all uncommon, so they know what they're doing here. After several hours of surgery, the hospital tweeted, quote, Representative Scalise was critically injured and remains in critical condition. The other patient is in good condition. That other patient is Crystal Griner on Scalise's protective detail. She's a member of the U.S. Capitol Police Force and was wounded in either the ankle or the foot. Among the visitors here today was the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police Force, who said that the other officer who was involved in that shooting, Mr. David Bailey, did not require treatment. Bailey, though, is largely credited with bringing down the gunman, and in so doing may have spared a much larger loss of life. Now for the status of the other victims, let's head over to Peter Ducey, who's at the George Washington University Hospital.
Doug, relatives of Matthew Micah just got here to George Washington University Hospital in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood of Washington, D.C., where they want to be by his bedside at the ICU, where they think he will be for the next couple of days. We first found out that Micah was one of the victims at this hospital from a member of Congress who had been at the baseball practice, and the Micah family says the former college baseball player who was helping coach the Republican team today and works here in Washington in the Government Affairs Office for Tyson Tyson Foods is in critical condition with multiple gunshot wounds. Those are injuries that required surgery today. Micah was one of 2 patients to arrive at this D.C. hospital in an ambulance from Alexandria, Virginia. The other was not a victim. It was the shooter, James Hodgkinson, who arrived here in critical condition but later succumbed to his injuries from gunshot wounds that were suffered when he was confronted by officers who stepped up to stop his ambush in Alexandria. Chris?
Peter Ducey and Doug McElway reporting from the 2 Washington hospitals where victims of the shooting are recovering. Efforts to cut gun violence and gain revenue from gun purchases have run into a setback in Seattle. Correspondent Dan Springer tonight with a big backfire for gun control.
An armed robbery in Seattle ends in a shootout with police. When it was over, 3 cops were injured, 1 critically, and the suspect was dead. It was just one of many recent shootings in the Emerald City this year, as gun violence has spiked, according to Seattle PD. The rise comes a year after Seattle started taxing every gun and bullet sold in the city, $25 per firearm, up to 5 cents for each round of ammunition. It was billed as a way to defray the cost of gun violence, study the problem, and ultimately reduce the carnage. Dave Workman of the Second Amendment Foundation says the tax is a total failure.
The data is there. It says that the law has failed to prevent what they promised it would prevent.
Since the tax took effect, reports of shots fired are up 26%, shooting injuries climbed 54%, and gun deaths doubled. The tax revenue is funding a University of Washington study looking at ways to reduce repeat gunshot victims.
These individuals are much more likely to come back with other gunshot wounds, to commit subsequent crime, to commit violent crime, or to be murdered.
But the tax is raising much less than advertised. Backers claimed it would bring in between $300,000 and $500,000 a year. The city refuses to say what the first-year revenue was, only that it was less than $200,000. Gun dealers believe it's much less. Still, Seattle's paying over $500,000 for the gun study. The bloodshed is up even as gun sales in Seattle plummet. An employee at this sporting goods store says it averages just a few buyers a month. The Precise Shooter store left Seattle and reopened in a neighboring suburb, where business is strong. The owner of the lone large gun dealer left in the city told Fox News he has had to lay off 7 employees with gun sales down 60%.
It's a form of gun control, and you know, it's hurting us, it's hurting my employees.
But gun control advocates say be patient.
The causes of gun violence are very complex, and to say that this one study is lacking because it hasn't solved the problem of gun violence in Seattle is frankly laughable.
Seattle police blame the jump in shootings on what plagues every big city: gangs, drugs, and retaliation. Elected leaders who pushed the gun tax declined our numerous requests for an interview. Chris?
Dan Springer reporting from Seattle. Dan, thank you. Up next, the panel discusses today's shooting in Alexandria, Virginia, and the reaction. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 2 in San Francisco, where at least 4 people are dead in a shooting at a UPS facility. One of the dead is the suspected shooter. The man is described as a disgruntled employee. Fox 29 in Philadelphia, as jury deliberations continue in the sexual assault trial of Bill Cosby. The actor and comedian could spend the rest of his life in prison if convicted of assaulting a woman at his Philadelphia area home back in 2004. And this is a live look at Atlanta from Fox 5. The big story there tonight: police have just found a car stolen by 2 escaped convicts who murdered 2 prison guards yesterday. Authorities say Ricky Dubose and Donnie Russell Rowe fled after shooting and killing a pair of sergeants from Baldwin State Prison. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.
I know what he asked me. I know how I answered. I know what happened. So I'm making the assumption that he was targeting Republicans.
There was a barrage of gunfire, and it was chaotic. It was horrible.
Without the Capitol Hill police, it would have been a massacre.
They attacked the shooter, and that saved our lives.
And in doing so, got injured themselves. It's remarkable heroism.
Republican members of Congress describing the frightening scene this morning when a gunman attacked them as they practiced for tomorrow's bipartisan congressional baseball game. Time to bring in the panel. Steve Hilton, host of The Next Revolution here on Fox News Channel. Katie Pavlich from townhall.com. Susan Page, Washington bureau chief of USA Today, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Well, Susan, I'm sure you've talked to a bunch of people today on Capitol Hill. How shaken are they? How hard has this hit them?
You know, I think it has hit people pretty hard. And I think they're shaken both because of the sense of personal peril in that most members of Congress don't have security with them. But also, in that maybe this will be short-lived, but I think there's also a sense of, have we gone so far in the fierceness of our political debates and in things like social media postings that go over the line of civil discourse that we ought to try to step back. And as I said, we've had that debate before. Is this the time when it has a more lasting effect than it's had?
Yeah, well, I want to pick up on that a little bit later.